we're going to begin now. Again, covenant, how the Bible hangs together. Week 2, Covenant of Works, Part 1 for our new Wednesday school class. I'm going to keep coming back to that, Wednesday school, until it gets old. All right, so again, we're starting with some review regarding this question, what is a covenant? What are some of the key features, some of the key, sorry about the baby noise in the background, pretty fun. The key words that we use to describe a covenant, what are some of the essential things that make up a covenant? You look at a relationship, you realize that's a covenant. What are some things that you're going to see? Either type it in the chat box or unmute your microphone and shout it out. Come on, don't be shy. Give you a hint. Oh, everlasting. I see everlasting. Okay, so yeah, covenants are durable, they last. Okay, Bill says promise. Covenants involve promises. So they involve not even more than we could say. We could take that a step further and describe them as binding oaths. They are very serious promises. Okay, what else? Keep going. Outward symbols. Great. So covenants often, if not always, involve some kind of outward symbol. And you think, just as a hook to hang it on, you think of a wedding ring and what it symbolizes about a marriage, binding two people together. It's not only the vows that they take, but the physical symbol that they give to one another. And that idea of physical symbolism and outward ritual going along with covenant making is very ancient and appears all through the scriptures. Okay, Bill says conditions. Conditions are key in this concept of covenant. And as we go along, we'll talk about that some, because different people deal with the idea of conditionality of a covenant in different ways. But condition is a key covenant concept. What else? Somebody want to give a shot at defining a covenant? What if somebody said, so what is a covenant? Can you tell me what it is in one sentence? What would you say?
I'd probably say promise. Yeah.
Come on. Do it. You really want to, you can read one of these off the page.
A promise with commitment.
A promise with commitment. That's a good ultra short definition. I like that. A promise with commitment. Okay. Now, we might make other promises that involve commitments that we would not describe as covenants. Maybe if you and I entered into a business agreement, we both signed on the dotted line, we're going to follow these rules, we're making a commitment, and we've made promises to each other, and they're enforceable by law, and yet it doesn't necessarily rise to the level of covenant. What else might we want to add there to take it to the level of covenant? Covenant is not the same thing as a contract, is it? A contract of adhesion. Okay, so it's somebody put this privately in group chat. So yeah, so adhesion, it binds things together. Think of an adhesive like glue or tape. So you've got it's like a contract, but it's binding. Okay, there's a relational aspect to it. Let's remember some of the definitions that we saw last time. A covenant. One, Michael Horton defines as a relationship, and that's a key part of the definition. We understand it's relational, a relationship of oaths and bonds involving mutual, though not necessarily equal, commitments. So both parties in a covenant make some kind of commitment, although those commitments are not necessarily equal. Sometimes they're quite one-sided in the kinds of commitments that are being made. It involves obligations on both sides. All right. Remember the Children's Catechism definition. Our relationship, I was actually just asking Alice this one tonight. We had to take it piece by piece because words like establishes and guarantees are a lot of syllables for a 3-year-old little mouth, newly 3-year-old. But a relationship that God establishes with us and guarantees by his word. Okay? You have that idea of that binding nature of it, bound by God's word itself. And remember how when God made the covenant with Abraham, Hebrews talks about how he swore by himself because there's nothing higher by which God can swear. God can't appeal to something greater than himself to swear by. He can only guarantee things by his own word. Remember how Tim Keller describes a covenant as a stunning blend of both law and love. So that means that it becomes more intimate and loving, he says, than a mere legal contract could create. And yet it's more enduring and more binding than personal affection alone could make. One or the other by itself, just the personal affection doesn't constitute a covenant, but neither does the pure legal relationship constitute a covenant. It's a blend of the two. It's a bond of love made more intimate and more solid, Keller said, because it's legal. So that intimacy and affection is not reduced by the legal binding nature of the relationship. It's actually increased by it because there's a sense of security and solidity that this isn't going anywhere. And we talked about how that effect occurs in marriage, which the Bible describes as a covenantal relationship, particularly in the prophet Malachi. The definition that we're going to come back to continually throughout this series is one by O. Palmer Robertson in his very well-known book, The Christ of the Covenants. And it's his definition, which gets points for brevity, for being short and really packed with meaning. Okay, well, I'm going to do this and I'll come back to what's in the chat there. So bond in blood sovereignly administered is Palmer Robertson's definition. A bond in blood sovereignly administered. So the bond, remember we talked about this being a binding relationship. It involves binding oaths. And this is also where the symbolic actions come, which is with marriage, it's like a wedding band being given, rings being exchanged. But in the Old Testament, you see all kinds of symbolic actions kind of ratifying these covenants. Sometimes it's gifts, sometimes it's people eating a meal together, or sprinkling blood, or making a sacrifice. In the case of Abraham, and it's referred to again in Jeremiah, we see these animals being divided and someone passing through the pieces saying, if I break this covenant, let me become like these dead animals that have been cut in two. All right. Okay, I see. Thanks for defining the contract of adhesion there. Yeah, so you're talking about terms and conditions being determined by one party. Yeah, that's when we get down to sovereignly administered. We'll get there in a second. So we've talked about covenants being a bond. Robertson also says they're a bond in blood, and by that he simply means that it's a life and death bond. This is not a casual thing. It involves life. It's a matter of life and death. There's the Jeremiah passage, Jeremiah 34, verses 18 to 20, that talks about passing through the pieces of the divided animals. When people make covenants in the Old Testament, the literal translation of the Hebrew phrase for making a covenant is to cut a covenant, karat barit, to cut a covenant. And very often in the Old Testament, covenant is associated with blood sacrifice. And then, so covenants involve life and death. And then the last part of that phrase, sovereignly administered, that means that the covenant is initiated by God, or in the case of human-to-human covenants between two people, we appeal to God as witness to the covenant, as the one who's going to enforce it. Make sure that the terms of the covenant are carried out, that people abide by the promises that they've made. That's why wedding vows are made before God, and why it's such a serious thing to break them, because we've called God to witness that, yes, I'm going to keep these commitments till death do us part. Right. So in the case of God's covenant with man, you never see an occasion in the scriptures where a person says, you know what, I want to have a relationship with God, so I'm going to initiate a covenant with the Lord. I'm going to tell the Lord, okay, God, here's what we're going to do. We're going to have this relationship, and here are the conditions, here are the terms, here's how this relationship is going to work. It never happens that way. It's always the Lord who makes the covenant with his people. And the few times where the Bible uses the language of people making a covenant with God, it's always in the context of a pre-existing covenant relationship that they're appealing to, that they're building upon as they renew that covenant relationship and they express their loyalty to it in a fresh way. All right, now we want to talk about how God always relates to his people covenantally. God always relates to his people covenantally. You think, wait, is that true? Is there some other way that God sometimes relates to? I don't think so. If you look at the scriptures, the testimony, the whole word of God, this is what makes understanding covenants so crucially important for Christians. The reason it's so important is because God never relates to his people. In fact, he never relates to any human being except through some kind of covenantal relationship. You say, that's a bold claim. Well, it is, but I think if you look through the scriptures, and as we see through the course of this series, I think you'll see that claim borne out as we see various covenantal relationships unfolding across the entire Bible, building upon one another. We see that there never is a time where the scriptures describe God relating to any human being outside of any kind of covenantal relationship, outside of any kind of binding relationship involving oaths and that is a matter of life and death and that is sovereignly administered by the Lord. Always. And that's why we need to understand covenants. So I want to read to you here from Westminster Confession of Faith, chapter 7, paragraph 1. This is a great sentence that's worth reading and rereading. I had a class, I think there was a professor in seminary that made us memorize this for like every class that he taught. Every class, I think I took 3 classes from this professor, and on every final exam, we had to write out Westminster Confession of Faith 7.1. So it's kind of ingrained in me. And actually, as I've been in ministry, I've realized how important it is time after time after time, because you keep coming back to this very foundational statement about how God relates to human beings. It says this: the distance between God and the creature is so great. If that's starting to sound familiar, it's because we talked about this a lot in our Doctrine of God class, how God is transcendent, how he is so infinitely above us. He is unlike us fundamentally in so many ways. And so now we're coming back to it again because of the way the paragraph goes on. The distance between God and the creature is so great that although reasonable creatures, that's us, reasonable, we have reason, so we're able to think, we do owe obedience unto him as their creator. We're bound to obey him because he made us, right? Yet they could never have any fruition of him as their blessedness and reward. That means we could never experience God's blessing, God's gifts to us. We could never have any positive kind of connection with God of any kind, but except by some voluntary condescension on God's part. For God to choose voluntarily, willingly, because he decides to, not because we reach up to him, to condescend, and that's not in the negative sense, like, oh, that person's being so condescending. It's in the sense that God is coming down to be with us. You may remember that from the Doctrine of God class. Condescend, coming down, descend, to be with us. Condescending, without some voluntary condescension on God's part, which he hath been pleased to express by way of covenant. Covenant is God's way of voluntarily coming down to be with us. Wanted to put that whole paragraph of 17th century English into a shorter statement. You can say that covenant is God's way of voluntarily choosing to come down to be with us. It is the only way that God ever relates to his creatures, all through the scriptures and all through life today for every single person who's alive on planet Earth at the present moment. Okay? One more little bit of review, and this is important because we're going to unpack it a little bit as we get into the covenant works today. I gave you a quote last time from Layne Tipton, and here I've spelled it out in the handout this time. This is from a OPC resource on the internet where I got the exact quote, but I remember him saying things very much along these lines in his seminary instruction at Westminster. But he says this, that in his covenantal kingdom, God seeks to commune with a holy people in a holy realm, advancing them beyond probation through the obedience of a federal head. And again, there's a lot of meaning packed in there, and not all the language is exactly clear when you read it for the first time. So we're going to unpack it as we get into the covenant of works, if not this week, then next week. But what we're getting in that sentence is a very compact statement of really the storyline of the entire Bible. All the scriptures are unpacking this theme of God seeking to commune with a holy people in a holy realm, advancing them, that's taking them beyond probation, beyond a testing period, through the obedience of a federal head that's a representative, someone who represents them all. Okay, so that's a way of summarizing the storyline of the Bible. And so in these diagrams that you see, we're going to come back to time and again during this class. You can see that kind of progression, kind of a in the one on the left, God's covenantal condescension, a little tree diagram over here. That's where you can see the covenant of works on the left, and then culminating in the new covenant on the top right. This progression of God accomplishing this purpose to commune with a holy people in a holy realm, but through the obedience of a representative. First Adam, who failed, and then Christ, who succeeded, not failed. And then you can see another way of picturing this in the diagram on the right, understanding the covenantal structure of the Bible, where you can see those same labels, covenant of works, and you see Adam, Noah, Abraham, Moses, David, and the new covenant in Christ is this expanding pattern over time as God gradually unfolds these covenantal relationships and takes them from seed form into full bloom in Christ in the end. Okay, so flip your handout over, and we're going to get into some of the covenantal aspects of creation. The word covenant is not used in the first 3 chapters of the Bible. But when we think and talk about the first 3 chapters of the Bible, I'm going to argue, and many others have argued, that we can't talk about what's going on there apart from the biblical terminology of covenant. The word doesn't appear, but the concept does. It's all over. And so we're going to talk about some of the covenantal aspects of creation, of the first 3 chapters of Genesis, so creation and fall. So let me ask you, I'm going to turn this back over to you and stop monologuing. I want to ask you, when you think about these aspects of covenant that we've talked about, the binding relationship, the visible signs, the life and death nature of it, the way it's sovereignly administered, all of these things we've talked about. Think about what you know about the story of creation, particularly the creation of mankind, of Adam and Eve. What elements, what aspects of this covenant concept do you recognize in what you already know about the first 3 chapters of Genesis? So, feel free to turn on your mic and talk it out loud.
Would it be Adam was created in God's image?
Okay, yeah, tell me how that relates to covenant. You are correct. Why are you correct? What about the image of God is covenantal? Or somebody else can try.
It has something to do with the relationship, or it has to do with the relationship between man and God, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, man being made in God's image has a lot to do with man's ability to relate to God, to experience communion with God. it also has to do with some of the responsibility that God gives to man, that's implied by man being made in his image, that man then has a duty towards the creation to represent God to the world. And so there's that dominion aspect. There's a job that God's given man to do, and that's part of that the covenant of what we call the covenant of creation. Perhaps. All right, what else? So we've got the image of God. What else do you see in those first 3 chapters of Genesis?
There's definitely a probation aspect.
Okay, so we've heard the term probation, and that simply means test. A probationary period is a testing period. And there is clearly a testing period for Adam and Eve where they're told, there's this one thing that you're not supposed to do. And it's a test of their faith. It's a test of whether they are going to listen to God or whether they're going to try to become autonomous, whether they're going to try to become a law to themselves, or they're going to try to assert themselves over against God and say, well, we're going to decide what we're going to do. We're going to be the captains of our fate. All right, Elizabeth says, conditions given by God for living in the garden. Yes, very good. In that initial relationship between God and man in the garden, there are these clear conditions. God says, you shall not eat of the tree in the middle of the garden, of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, for the day that you eat of it, you will surely die. And we see those, that God makes good on those conditions, on those threats, on those covenantal warnings, in the end when Adam disobeys and he's cut off from that tree of life. Okay, good. Right, somebody said privately, a mutual pact or agreement. Yeah, there's a pact, and of course that's made, and we'll talk about that as we go. And we, of course, we want to remember that it is sovereignly administered. It's something that God puts into place, and that man doesn't. You don't see man negotiating it with God in any way. Okay, so let's talk about this. Aspects. Let's begin with Robertson's definition and kind of do some analysis with that. So we've got covenantal aspects of creation, aspects of a bond in blood sovereignly administered that we see here. Let's start with Genesis 1:26 and 27. And Derek already brought this up. This is where we see God creating man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. And so fundamentally, if man is made in the image of God, there's going to be this relationship between man and God that's made possible by God making man in his own image. Unlike any of the other creatures that are incapable of having communion with God in the way that man is, because God has made man to be like him in certain ways that make man able to engage in this unique kind of relationship with God that no other creature can. A cow cannot have a covenantal relationship with God, but a man or a woman can. And so there's a relationship. That's fundamental. But it's not just a relationship, it's a sovereignly administered relationship. And this is very important. When you look at the next verse, what is the first thing that God says to man after he creates him in his image?
Be fruitful, multiply, and have dominion.
Yeah, so if you are a grammar nerd like me, can somebody tell me, is that indicative or is it imperative? In other words, is God making a statement or is he giving a command? Statement or command? Take a vote in the group chat.
It was a command.
A command. Okay, we got one vote. There you go. It's unanimous. The ayes have it. It's command. The very first thing God says to man is a command. It's not, hi, Adam, I've just made you, and I was just wondering, would you like to be in a covenantal relationship with me? Because I had this great idea, and I thought maybe if we made a pact together, we can work out the details. I want to hear your side, your perspective on things. Let's see what we can work out that would be mutually agreeable to us. Is that the way that the covenant is established? Is that the way that God's relationship with his creature is established in the beginning? Absolutely not. No, very good. I like that. Amen. Okay, so first thing, God creates man in his image, and then he gives him a command immediately, because the relationship with God and man is sovereignly administered by God. God is the one in charge. We were talking earlier, as we were sharing with each other, about the importance of this doctrine of the sovereignty of God. And it's very fundamental from the very first chapter of Genesis. Not only is God the creator, but then when God creates man, he's the one who establishes the terms of this relationship that he's going to have with his creatures. It's not a negotiation. It is a sovereignly administered relationship. Next, we can see that it is a binding, sovereignly administered relationship. Hang on a second. Next, we can see that it is a binding, sovereignly administered relationship involving both binding promises and binding commands. You see that God binds himself to something, right? Adam doesn't bind God to anything, does he? There's nothing that Adam says, okay, God, here's what you have to do. No, God, though, does bind himself to certain promises. He says in verses 29 and 30, behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed, etc. You shall have them for food. And it was so. So God binds himself to certain promises. Those aren't the only promises he makes, but those are some key ones. And then he also gives these binding commands. You see that later in chapter 2, when God gives the command about how you may surely eat of every tree in the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you shall not eat. You shall not eat of that tree. So you've got a binding relationship, binding promises, binding commands. And then next we can say that it's a life and death relationship as well. We see both the language of death and the language of life. So how is it how does death enter into this picture? We've got that's obvious. God says if you eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you will surely die. Well, what about life? Where does life come in? Is there a promise of life anywhere if Adam obeys? Think about it carefully. Is there a promise of life? This is kind of a trick question because it's not explicitly stated, but it is very clearly symbolized. What is in the garden besides the tree of the knowledge of good and evil?
The tree of life was there, and which Adam was free to eat at any time.
Yes, and what happens when Adam sins? What happens with the tree of life?
It is guarded and kept from them.
Yeah, one of the key penalties when Adam sins is he is cut off from the tree of life. And so you think about the idea we were talking about earlier of the physical symbols ratifying a covenant, like the exchange of wedding rings. You can see those appear even here in the very opening chapters of the Bible as you have these two trees that symbolize this covenant relationship and the conditions and the consequences of obedience and disobedience and all these things. There they are, right there. You've got one representing death and one representing life. The things that God is going to have. So if Adam obeys, he is going to experience what the tree of life represents. If Adam rebels, he's going to surely die. And so you have these we could call them sacramental signs involved in this covenant. And I use that term carefully. It's kind of New Testament language of sacrament that I'm kind of reading back in to the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But I'm doing that on purpose, and I hope that you'll see as we go through some of the other covenants, this repeated pattern coming out of things that resemble the New Testament sacrifices being prefigured in these types and shadows, such as these two trees in the Old Covenant, as we go through time. Okay. Last thing I want to talk about from Robertson, and then I'll stop before we get to the Tipton part. O. Palmer Robertson is in his chapter on what he calls the covenant of creation. Talks about how there's kind of a general aspect and a what he calls a focal or a more specific or focused aspect of this covenant relationship that God establishes with man. And so some of the more general aspects of this covenant relationship involve things like the Sabbath day. So in Genesis chapter 2, God finishes his entire work of creation, and he rests from all his work that he had done. And so God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it God rested from all his work that he had done in creation. Now, it does not go on to say, and then God commanded Adam that you shall work for 6 days, and then on the seventh you shall rest. Just taking these chapters alone, it would stand to reason that it would seem natural for Adam's pattern of work and rest to resemble God's as he entered upon his labors of tending and keeping the garden. But we don't have to just rely on that inference, because then when you get to the Ten Commandments, when you get to Exodus chapter 20, and God's explaining why should you remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Why is that? Well, it's because in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that is in them, and he rested on the seventh day. So the Sabbath command is not an arbitrary imposition at Mount Sinai. The Sabbath command is not kind of a type and shadow associated with the ceremonial law and the tabernacle and the sacrificial system. No, God says you're to keep the Sabbath day because it's built into the fabric of creation. It's part of this creation covenant. God established this pattern of work and rest in his own creative work, and now he has given it to you as part of his law that you're to imitate that in your pattern of work and rest. And that's why, among other things, why the Sabbath command did not expire with the coming of Christ like so much of the ceremonial law did, because the Sabbath is not rooted in the ceremonial law, it's rooted in creation, just like marriage is. Marriage also didn't go away when Christ came, because it's not a ceremonial requirement, it is a creation ordinance. And that's the second part of this general aspect of God's covenant creation, is God establishes marriage. When Jesus is giving his perspective on marriage in Matthew 19, he goes back to the book of Genesis. He says, don't you know that in the beginning God made the male and female, and let what God joined together let no man tear asunder. God roots his perspective on marriage in creation, and what God does right here in Genesis chapter 2. And then the last thing is labor of this general aspect. So God ordains labor for man. Again, the first thing God does when he creates man is he gives him a job to do. He says, here's what you're to do. You're to go take dominion. When he puts him then in the Garden of Eden, he puts him there for a purpose. What? To tend it and to keep it. And so, work is not a result of the fall. Work is part of creation. Labor is part of this general covenantal arrangement of the way that God is going to relate to man. Is he wants man to have a job to do. He wants people to live within this structure that he is building for their time, for their family, for their work, for every aspect of human life. It's all going to be governed within the context of this binding relationship with God, which is a matter of life and death, and which is administered sovereignly by God, where God is in charge as the great king over his creatures in this loving relationship of communion and fellowship that is also a solemn bond. It's a covenant. That's what's going on. But then, of course, in addition to that general aspect of the creation covenant, there's the focal aspect, which is that probation, that testing period. Are you going to eat of that tree of the knowledge of good and evil? Are you going to take God at his word? Or are you going to assert yourself and your own autonomy and your own sovereignty, so-called, over against that of the Lord, and try to make yourself God when the devil tempts you to do so? And so that's what Robertson calls the focal aspect of this covenant of creation. And it's really where we end up landing when we start talking more specifically about the covenant of works, which we'll get to next time. Okay, so that wraps up today's lesson on this, and we'll just pick up right where we left off next time by talking about, by analyzing those same chapters in light of the Tipton explanation of God's covenantal kingdom and his desire to commune with a holy people in a holy realm, etc.